Hello and welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 129. Please follow IOH on LinkedIn to support the live stream and contact us if you'd like to propose an episode. Our guest today is Kevin Campman, Gartner alum and currently principal consulting analyst at TechVision Research. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be here again. I follow a lot of the conversations that go on in this area, and you had said something at one point that really triggered if you will, something that I've been dealing with in the last 25 or so years as an analyst, and prior to that, as a practitioner in the field. So now that I'm retired, I have time to think, if you will, to ponder these things and say, well, in some cases, I've gone back and said, hey, we were really off base on some of these things. But one of the persistent challenges in terms of access control is not mixing inappropriate things. One of my friends or one of my peers at Gartner, Ann Thomas Maines, said it's a separation of concerns. You have to decide what category things belong in, and that's a very complicated task, and in identity management, it has been a challenge. Even from its inception, I will scold the Unix, Linux folks. I will scold Microsoft and say, you really don't have a clear line of demarcation between users and resources in your product, in your technology, right? Everything blends around things like groups and quote unquote roles, and you have this complexity that you're dealing with. And so since that's not clear, and we don't do a good job of articulating that, particularly on the people side, it tends to get very complicated over time, particularly as this ages. And we're only in this, hey, we're still the first generation, right?
And this seems to be along the theme of that one of the homework you assigned a blog from TechVision. I guess it was Gary Zimmerman's blog, and it's titled "IGA Has Failed: A Critical Analysis of Identity Governance and Administration."
Right.
And I also want to reference today something from today. Radovan, the CTO and co-founder of Evolvium, based in Europe, put out a blog, something about, to the extent of it's titled "Dead Ends in Identity Management," and it has a really similar read. And I hear from what you're saying in this intro that you feel like somehow the approach that we're taking in the IAM space. Well, I want to cut everyone some slack. I think that everyone did their best in the last 20 years to try and figure out how to deal with this. But what we're seeing is that, it's not just, it's like there's a sort of consensus that what we're doing it hasn't really answered all of the challenges that we're facing. You think that that's right?
I think that's true. And when a lot of the approaches were constructed, and I'm going to pick on NIST RBAC, there was this notion that we understood resources very well, and we also understood organizations very well. And we don't understand organizations, and they don't fit a mold. They're organisms, right? They're full of little cellets that do different things. If they're, you know, if you look at a picture of a paramecium, there's lots of little uh, objects in there that do unique things in that one single cell, right? And this is what organizations are like, and they react differently. And you know, they go to sleep sometimes, and they have a purpose that comes into play. If there's a virus, right, then they come into play to deal with that, or a bacteria. So you know, some of them are defensive, some of them are the life support system of the cell. Some of them move the cell. They have little hairs on the side that act like rowing oars to move the thing around.
Yeah, no, I
So
would agree with you, and I would wonder if an organization like NIST has a more like ordered view of the world than maybe it intersects with actual reality. Like especially just using Glue as an example, Glue's a very global and flat organization, um, and doesn't fit into quite the hierarchical like
right,
mold that your typical government agency does, I assure you.
this is how government structures itself. It's very hierarchical. It's a very European approach that is carried over here, but we have different management styles. If you look at organizational design, we have matrix management, we have that flat model that you're talking about. Uh, you know, I talked to a company in the Nordics when we tried to deal with this notion, and they said, well, you know, we don't really have an organization. We talk to people as we need to, right? But they're all individuals. They have to do different things, and we know what they do, but we don't follow an organization chart to get to the people we're working with. Now that works in small organizations and small communities, but as you start to bring that together, you need organization. Look at what we do with directory services, right? We hardwired in so many concepts about hierarchies that, you know, when Sun said, hey, we don't need all that stuff, we need to just kind of throw it out and go to a flat model, it made sense, because you know, even if you did that successfully, organizations change, and everything you hardwire into it has to be restructured. So you can't build those dependencies in, right? Uh, but we did our best to do it, and we had to back off from that. But you can look at the heritage of networking systems; they follow that model, right? And it's flattened out over time to become, you know, everything's on an equal level to it,
I
as
want
the
to bring out another change, which I would say is like companies have a lot of it's their digital footprint is a lot of software that's being continuously developed and improved.
Mhm.
And one of my guests, we did an episode on some of the challenges around IGA, and one of my guests, he highlighted two things that I think are very true. One is that the success of the project is tightly tied to like leadership and the leadership buying in. Um, and the other thing that he pointed out, which was more subtle, was about change management and how can be a real disconnect between how the team that's building the software that thinks about CI/CD pipelines and GitHub issues and reviewing PRs and approving PRs and that leading to software being built, how that process, that change control process, is very different from sort of your traditional like management sort of people-oriented change control process. Um, but I want to start with the business leaders. You know, everyone says, well, the business leaders are, for not surprisingly, focused on revenues and product, right? And they're not so focused on expenses and identity and access, you know, management. Let's say, um, but is this actually like a bad thing? Because do we really want our CEOs, you know, thinking about this? You know, I've been in a lot of software companies where I worked at a large financial institution, and I can guarantee you the CEO couldn't tell you the difference between CEDAR and Rego, you know?
Mhm. Sure.
So,
Go back to my paramecium thought, right? Those little functions in the organization don't worry necessarily too much about the other things except the messaging that takes place between them, right? The impetus or the signals that
yeah,
are
the interfaces.
when you look at the paramecium, the person who's responsible for the operation of that doesn't necessarily think about what's going on inside the organization. That's been, that's kind of, you can't afford to do that, right? You're focused outward. You're focused on revenue for the most part, and push that off into push those concerns off into different parts of the organization. They don't do recruiting. They don't do
Yeah, I had a great manager. This guy Justin Jasky. He did an epic roll up of ISPs in the '90s, and I ended up working for him. Um, and he said something that really shocked me at the time. He's like, "Don't CC me on emails. Don't pull me in." He's like, "Your job is to suppress information so that when you do send me something, I know it's important." Um,
Yep.
and so the whole point of management, from his perspective, was for parts of the organization to suppress information so he could just focus in his 8 hours on what he had to do to generate shareholder value.
Right.
So
And leadership is supporting, right? We invert this. We put the leadership at the top. But the job of leadership is to be the foundation, to lead people in that direction. So I am empowered in my organization to be an analyst, and I don't want anybody to get in my way. And so, I've fought that tendency to CC everybody, right? Because that just fills up inboxes, which nobody reads, right? I can tell you now, being retired, that I read 5% of what goes into my email, and the rest of it, I don't pay any attention to. It doesn't impact that we grain notion that we have to tell everybody what we're doing. Well, that's not true. We just need to tell people when we have a problem, or when we need input, or when we have a success. Meantime, it doesn't matter. If you're capable and competent and doing your job. So that's why these functions are separated out. And so if you have to have a hierarchy to feel good, that's fine. But the reality is most organizations don't work that way anyway. It's just a modeling template. And so the problem is it ingrained everybody's thinking, right? So NIST kind of embedded that into this whole notion of roles, the notions of things like inheritance, and if I'm in this chain of command, or whatever flows down from the top, I get that as a result of inheritance, or I may not, right? That's a decision that has to take place somewhere. Do we really do that? We've tried, and the other issue is when we try these things, we forget. so it's usually an exercise that we don't document. It doesn't correspond to the way we do things. By the time we're done, it's changed. And so we really have to be very discreet about those organelles. That's the word I was looking for. Those organelles, or what do they do? and
my 10th grade biology is coming back. Thank you, Kevin.
Right. Well, there's actually someone in our community that wrote about this. His name was Beard.
Was it Patrick Parker, the biologist, the ex-biologist?
Beard, a guy named Beard, and I've got the book somewhere, but it really struck me. But it has never clicked with people. But now I have the opportunity to think about this. He was right, and so that was a model that made sense. You think about things in terms of what they do, or what they're responsible for, and maybe what happens if they're not there. So that's a new way of thinking. And we also, people are are not the problem. It's just a much more organizational challenge. Well, developers don't necessarily think that way. They want it to be clear. They want it to be logical. They want it to be binary, and they want black and white. And you can design an application that way. You can say, here's all the predicates for what I need to fulfill what my application does. I don't manage that on the people or the organization side. And we continue to find this out as we move towards things like zero trust, where we have to have information that's current and relevant to satisfy those requirements or that information need that the developer built into the application. And this is what IGA has been about the whole time. It's data management. Where do we find the data? How do we organize the data? How do we make it accessible? How do we protect it? And how do we catalog it? Where is it? We can't have all of it. That's the other battle that we've fought or continue to fight. Is there's information you need that you don't own, or that's not accessible to you. So there's a governance conversation that has to take place that says, if we're going to do this in the business, how do we satisfy that? And you need a virtual directory sometimes just to know how that. Virtual directory is a governance tool in many ways because it knows where the data is and what data is current and relevant. So
I want to actually go back to the data later, but take this opportunity to, we didn't officially announce the topic. So the topic was function-based access control.
Yes.
And I want to go back to another Radovan quote from today. He talks about, now we were talking about NIST and NIST approach, how influential that's been to our approach to access management. And in Radovan's white paper, he mentions he says identity governance is concerned with the inventorization, ownership, and responsibility, and identity management and governance. Okay, but just looking at this word inventorization, which I'm not sure is actually a word. It seems like it should be, but we'll just go with it. It seems like NIST's approach was to inventory the people and say, here are the people, what can they do? And then we'll look at all the life cycle of a person, and every time something changes, we'll get an audit of that. And therefore, we'll always know what changed in our security, because the totality of our security world is defined by people. Therefore, if we just manage changes about people, we'll have a good view about the world. So this whole approach starts with an inventory of the people, and I've been saying maybe that's the wrong inventory we're doing, and maybe the inventory should be about capabilities, because capabilities are more directly related to risk. The person is not a risk. The ability, to shut off the electricity and take down the plant that makes $10 million an hour, that's a risk. The person himself is not the risk. And so maybe this framework is wrong. Not only is the hierarchy that we were talking about, but potentially doesn't apply to a lot of our organizations, but maybe the very thing that we're inventorying, people, was the wrong thing
to start with.
Yeah.
And number one, good luck. We've been trying for 30 years to get that perspective on everybody. And people who have tried this have discovered that that's a moving target at best, right? When you describe people, you're describing a persona, right? and then you fit people into the personas. A good example to think about, I did some work with
And when you say personas, you mean even when you attempt this exercise, you start having to generalize about roles in
absolutely.
order to say, because you don't
Yeah,
want to make a, I don't want to make a Kevin role. I want to make a analyst role. And
yes,
therefore, because there might be a new analyst and I don't want to waste, have to redo the policy just because Kevin's not there anymore. And so then when we make this abstraction into roles, that's when we start to even have trouble like getting all the roles, and just even today, figuring out all the roles is a challenge, let's say.
that's a challenge for,
Role
okay,
mining.
my little function, right? I don't use the same vocabulary. I know I have analysts, but I don't, and I know Kevin covers one topic and Joe covers another topic, but they're still analysts, right? So there's degrees of specificity that you need to have. Is it all analysts, or is it the one that does access management, right? So that only works in that community. Does it apply anywhere else, right? So in the plant, the electricians that cover the power systems, where are they located? They're in maintenance, right? So you have a maintenance function in the organization, and within that you have electricians, you have carpenters, you have welders, you have blacksmiths. Actually worked in a company like that, and each of those persons had a specialization, but they all worked under this topic of maintenance, but they weren't interchangeable, right? So this capability, or I actually consider it responsibilities, right? So I'm going to play along with your conversation here. The capability is what resources do. The responsibility is the party that uses those resources, right? So they have to have training, they have to have authority delegated to them. They have to have the knowledge it takes to use that. They have to fit within policy to say this person matches this set of requirements called capabilities, right? So I would put responsibility on the left to balance the things we understand, which are applications, which are predictable, and they are constrained.
Yeah.
So
So just start the capabilities as a starting point. We have a capability.
I love
We
it.
might want to know why do you have this capability? Like why I
Well,
say, okay, there's a capability called publish report. Why does
right.
Kevin have that? And that's a different question. And who has this capability? Um, but starting from the capability, in my opinion, gives us a better way to relate to risk. Because that ultimately, tying this back to the business leaders, I don't think the business leaders care about identity. What they care about is risk. And so when we start with the people, we immediately have this disconnect where we have to it's hard to make the leap from people to risk, but it's easy to make the leap from capabilities to risk. Um,
You
and
can
then and then we can start to say, oh, who has this capability? And why
right.
do they have that capability? And how did they get that capability? And so it's a simple change, but when you change that starting point, it has big implications down the road.
Okay, so there are so we had this conversation. We have technical capabilities, we have business capabilities, right? So let's take business continuity. I took this model and tried to map it into business continuity. When the flag goes up and something goes wrong, let's say COVID, uh, people can't come into work anymore. You need to understand the people in the organization that can do certain things, right? You just can't slap people into positions and say, okay, now you're in charge of plant power generation or shipping, right? You can't do
Yeah.
that. You have to have an understanding of what people can fit into a persona. A persona describes a role, if you will. And but we have beyond that, we have to understand what goes into that role that we can assemble that we need to make those requests. So because the people change, as you pointed out, situations change, the continuity of the workflow changes. All of these things are variable. And this is why zero trust is so interesting, because zero trust says at runtime, I have to be able to collect all these things and validate them.
Yeah.
Right? That's the identity. That's the identity problem, is to say, what are the things we need to identify and articulate in the populations that we manage? And who does that? Right? Is it the manager? Is it the individual? Is it human resources? Is it a licensing group that says you have this capability? Assembling all that, you can't put it all in one place. So you need mechanisms that, like a virtual directory, that point to all these different sources, which you may or may not have control over. Right? So for example, you need to talk to the telco to figure out where I'm located, right? You can use geolocation or network location to find out where I'm located, because you don't want me doing something if I'm not in a particular protected environment. So you might make that a requirement for, or a capability that has to be in place, that that I am on premise, as opposed to working somewhere that's not.
Yeah, the context might pay into the policy. I was going to say that actually, going back to Radovan white paper again, I put that one up on the link, by the way. Thank you, Radovan. He says something that's sort of terrifying. He says, nobody really knows what the policy is or how it should look like. So I'm hassling Radovan again on his English, which isn't perfect, but I wish I spoke a second language as well as he speaks English. I can only dream of speaking, but I think what he's saying here is that people, and especially the business people, the number of policies are so complex that there's sort of a secret that everyone thinks like somebody understands like what the policies are. But the truth is that nobody understands what the policies are, which is kind of terrifying. But at the same time, I remember when I read about phone numbers, the AT&T decided to make them 7 digits because human beings can keep 7 things in their mind. If you have thousands of policies, like it shouldn't really be a surprise that nobody knows what the policies are. You can't keep them in your head. It's too hard. And so my conclusion in this, and maybe this is my overly geeky response, is that we need tools, and we need sort of logical tools that can really help us compare these policy sets before and after when we make changes, and to really understand the current state of the security. If I say all of my computers have port 80 closed, I want to know that that's true today and true in the future. And so I think what we don't want to do is audit. What we want to do is being able to assert the rules that we need in order to comply with SOC and with other certifications. And given the thousands of policies that might exist about our infrastructure and our applications, this is left the realm of when people should be involved. We shouldn't be surprised our CEO can't understand it, because maybe our CISO can't do it either without tools.
This is one area, and so policies are rules. It's an if-then construct, generally, in most cases, right? You either can or cannot satisfy the requirements of that rule. The issue is they do relate, because you may have lots of rules that are triggered when you evaluate what needs to be there. This is why I break policy out as the way to bind these things together, people and resources, because all of those conditionals have to be surfaced. And you don't, who puts those into the applications? The developer and the application owner, right? They determine the conditions to say you can use this, correct? So you can articulate that, but that's for that application. Is there a policy library? Sometimes you can extract that and say, okay, here's a common policy for accounting, right? It goes back to the accounting rules or policy.
So in my view of this, the application developers should expose their capabilities. So when you're sitting down to write an application, you don't write the policies. The CISO writes the policies. But what you do is you say, my application has these capabilities. My application has a red button which shuts power down to the plant. Now, what's the policy for who can touch that? That's up to the CISO, really. But the what you're saying is actually true most of the time, which is that the application developers don't know how to expose, or there's no convention to expose the capabilities. So they end up having to do a person to capability mapping, where the organization doesn't send them like policy decisions. The organization says, here's the user role. And then within the application, they have to map that to their capabilities. And they're responsible for showing those rules to the CISO. But whether that happens and whether the CISO has the tools to analyze them is another question.
And this is one place where inheritance really does apply, because the policies, this is one of the things I reviewed at Gartner with company policies. They don't articulate down to the level of those rules. You have a hierarchy that says the plant requires power, and we will make our best effort to make sure that power is maintained. And then that rule or policy flows down to decisions like that red button that they don't know about, right? They don't worry about that. All they care about that the lights are on, right?
They don't know about the red button because there's a policy that says the plant should always have power. So therefore, it's implicit you should never touch the red button.
Right. So there is that policy hierarchy that exists. The same thing happens with people in positions or roles that, okay, let's take HIPAA, for example. What records can a doctor or a nurse see? Has to do with privacy constraints. You only get to see the information and some of the information about a patient that you are responsible for. You can't just go peruse it. Well, actually, it turns out you can get fired for this, but you can peruse all the patient records. But that's the policy is.
So your universal statement might be no nurse should have access to records for a patient who she's not actively caring for.
Exactly.
Right. So you want to make statements like that. You don't want to review the roles of nurses and review the capabilities and figure out. You really want to be able to make sort of these statements about security.
Right.
And I've seen, what I'm seeing is that for the reason I like CEDAR is that through formal reasoning, we're able to make these universal statements, which can then be evaluated versus the policies that you have. Whereas all the mechanisms we've seen in the past of auditing and access certification and trying to come out with roles don't really, this is just not working. And it's especially showing signs of where, as we introduce, as basically, there's a saying, software is eating the world. And there's 10 pieces of software for every human, at least, if not 100. And so now that there's more, we're managing the access of humans, and not very successfully. And now we added in 100 times more entities that are non-humans. And now we're trying to take our same broken human approach and apply that to non-humans, is what I see a lot of. oh, here's a new identity management system for NHIs, and we're going to use the same broken approach. Um, so
Yeah,
anyway, maybe
you
I'm
have,
just getting cynical.
right? Well, this is a problem, but you have to be able, when you're articulating what an identity is, you have to be able to make assertions about that identity,
Yeah.
right?
Well, people are still important.
Right? And then those assertions are what we use to determine whether a policy is satisfied. And the issue is that we aren't very good at cataloging that for people, or catalog. Well, we do a pretty good job with people for certain things, but the whole ITIL approach around managing assets was something that I think was heading in that direction. Also, SIM was heading in that direction, and you can only do your best case of working with things. You have to work your way out. You have to start from the bottom up in many cases to say, here's what I need, but I can't deal with the universe of all different possibilities. We may see AI become a good data manager for those things, but we don't have time to go scan all of the policy information that exists in an organization or a community or in the country, in a population, and be thorough about it. So I think we all understand this stuff implicitly, but we only deal with the context that we're looking at. We're not dealing with the universe, but we do run into these things. Like, I don't know how an Indian culture does things. I learned a few things about it this month or last month, but it's not within my worldview right now. What you do need to be is flexible enough, and this is hard for people, to be flexible enough to accept things not the way they are, not the way you think they are or should be, but the way they are, right? And you have to change your thinking. That's very hard for people in the for discussions about people, right? And we have a very Western view of this, Mike. It doesn't work in other cultures. So we need to step back and say, what are the things we have certainty about? What are the things we don't have certainty about? And the population that you're dealing with, does it actually suit them based on the applications? I can tell you, no Indian tribe really wants to deal with an ERP system until you get into the casinos. So it's just not. It's just they're adopting our view of the world when they do that, right? So we have all these culture clashes that we have to contend with, just like this company in the Nordic world. When they said we don't have roles because everybody's unique, it took me aback. I'm still thinking about what they meant by that. 20 years later, how did they function? They don't exist anymore. They got bought up, but that was a unique view in the world of what we were trying to do with role management.
So if you could start over today and consider other cultures, how would you take a different approach?
How would I take a different approach? Well, the one, again,
So your nest in 1988, and you have the benefit of hindsight. What do you think you do differently today?
Well, and I wrote the paper on how IGA has failed. So if you want to look at that, that's a synopsis of things that I saw, that including assumptions that I thought broke. But the first thing I would do is be very careful about scope, right? Because am I dealing with a function? Am I dealing with an organism? How do those two things relate? And what information is unique to that context? And don't try and solve world hunger. Focus on the problem at hand. And have a mechanism in place to document. People hate to document. They absolutely hate it. So we need to force their hand by having an assistant, if you will, that can do that. We have voice to text. We have, in the AI world, I can't buy a product that doesn't have AI built into it. But what's that doing for me? It's recording the things I wouldn't record otherwise. It's looking at the things that I wrote. So we need to document this. We need to organize it so that as I build that knowledge of how this worked, I can contribute to the, if you will, the large language model of my organization and how it's structured so that we don't lose sight of what the assumptions were. You look at Active Directory, people struggle. I mean, it's what, 30 years old now? People are
Oh, yeah, 20. I think 23 or 24, something like that. It
it
came
just
out
had
slightly after 2000. Yeah,
yeah, it had its anniversary. Well, and so 25 years. So
yeah,
uh, so administrators dealt with a very narrow focus. Those people are gone. We don't understand why they did things the way they did. And did the organization remain consistent with that? No. Did the tools remain consistent with that? No. They're embedded. Those directories are embedded with information that's not even relevant. That's a huge security risk because nobody takes anything away. We have habits we have to counter. So in a perfect world, we would have something that does the dirty work that we don't really want to do. So I'm a very strong proponent of how we can teach AI to do this, to manage the risk of the things that we've done in the last 30 years so that we clean up, if you will, and improve the approach we take to getting things done and documented and managed properly. Because we just can't do it ourselves. We just don't have the inclination or the capacity mentally to understand, to do those things, right? And
yeah,
I've seen it in practice. You can look at my paper that competes with the other gentleman's paper, but these are the things. These are the struggles that we have, not understanding the scope of a situation and not articulating it well. So we've tried to do this, and we have not done a good job of it. But Zero Trust puts us on notice that we have to start being able to identify and articulate and manage those information assets properly.
yeah. And we no live stream is complete today without a discussion of AI.
Yep.
That was my question, but I see the birds are telling me that we're coming up on the end. But I do think it's interesting. I'm not sure if AI is going to help us, but I really worry about the guardrails for AI. That AI is only I wrote a blog a while back that said this is how we get to the Terminator: improper guardrails around AI, and I
Mhm.
think that's real. So I think that there's both an opportunity there, so that we don't have to do as much drudgery. No, there's no drudgery more soulless than having to do access certifications for your reports. Nobody wants to do that.
If you do it right, okay, let me be a curmudgeon because that's one of the things I am now. If you
Yeah,
do things right in the beginning, it makes access certification a breeze, right? But if you don't understand what you were doing and don't document it, and is this the right thing for this person? Well, I thought so. But if you have that mapping of responsibilities to capabilities, if you look at my diagram, which is kind of a takeoff on NIST, you have three things. You have responsibilities, policy, and capabilities that tie these things together. And so if you can keep track of the decisions that were made under what constraints and what assumptions on the operational side that you made, it's going to make access certification more straightforward, because the only thing you really want to certify is exceptions. And that's been a large argument. Instead of going out and having to do, let's solve world hunger again this month. No, let's worry about the things that changed.
Yeah. And I sort of think I'd like to see access certification go away, and like us to say, here are the things I know people shouldn't be able to do. Nobody can do this, right? Not go through every person and say they can't do this, they can't do this, they can't do this.
Those
So
systems are designed to what if, right?
yeah, I feel like we need more operational leverage. Like the CEO who doesn't want to be CC'd on every email. It's all about time and how much time can a human spend on this. And with the distraction of AI, every CEO wants to know how can I use AI to drive revenue or to improve my product. And we want them focusing on that. And they need more operational leverage to also know that they're secure, and to know what are the assumptions we're making about security and how can I quickly and efficiently review them. But we're sort of out of time. I'm going to give you last thoughts, takeaways, things, next steps, things you want to promote.
Certainly, the idea is to keep it simple. Understand what the problem space is that you're trying to solve. I mentioned separation of concerns. Don't tie people and applications together. Understand what binds them and what you need to make those decisions, right? That's not hard, and you should have that conversation before you get in deep into any development effort. And that'll make it easier to do things like zero trust. It'll make it easier to do things like application development, because you only have to concentrate on what you need, not the context in which all this information flows. We do need more data governance. This is a failure on our part to keep track of what information we have, what of that information is authoritative, and who owns it. How do we get to that information? So I'm a strong proponent for governance, particularly in that area, because AI just thrives on it. And if it's bad, it's garbage in, garbage out. That's the real risk.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to go there to data, but I think we're out of time. So maybe next time, back to the pigeons. And actually, I'm excited to announce that our next episode, we'll have Rainer Horba, who's also be a two-time guest, second appearance. Rainer is going to set me straight on why I'm wrong about PAM. I'm very dismissive of PAM. I say PAM is just like it's an admission that we failed, and it takes a bunch of one-offs and it consolidates, so you have one. Instead of having 5 one-offs, you have one one-off for 5 things, but it's still a one-off. Anyway, I'm very skeptical about PAM. CyberArk announced they got acquired today, by the way, by Palo Alto. Speaking of PAM news. But anyway, Reiner's going to set me straight next Tuesday on why I'm wrong. So looking forward to that. Kevin, it's a pleasure having you back again, getting to visit for a little while, pulling you out of retirement, at least temporarily, to get your thoughts as they've evolved. So thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you, audience, for tuning in. I see some chat, which I'm sorry I missed when I was listening to Kevin, but I will address on LinkedIn afterwards. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you, audience, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Mike. And it was a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.